Okay,
Alright, so yeah. Go ahead.
So, as you're tired, do you want me to organize this? Because I'm quite happy to step in.
I think I can at least start it up. So, alright, this week's readings were very long, as y'all might have noticed. So to put this in context, the first week's readings added up to about 20,000 words total. This week's reading, 58,000 words, which puts it at almost 3 times as long.
And that was with it being cut down.
Yes. So, a bit of a more material to work through. I think some of us did manage to work through it. I'm not sure who all did. I got distracted by stuff. Was planning to finish last night. Got sidetracked into a veganism debate, which is not relevant here. Yeah. So,
But fun.
from what I
and
understand,
it is kind of relevant. It is kind of relevant,
is
though.
it?
Well, I mean, we
Anyway,
never mind. Carry on. Okay.
So
yeah. So
what we're saying is we're just making an excuse that many of us have not done the reading. So those who are listening to this, we're sorry. We only read half of it. But okay, this week we read, or some of us read, some parts of How to Become Post-Human and Virtual Bodies in Cybernetics Literature and Informatics by N. Catherine Haley's. Do we have a say how that?
I think it Hales, but I could be wrong.
Hales. And Our Post-Human Future by Francis Fukuyama. So, hands up, who read one or both of these completely, at least of the reading set?
I read both of them. Not sure if I understand it either, but...
Okay, who wants to try and summarize these two works so that we can actually discuss them? Squishy, did you actually end up making notes?
Did I end up making notes? No, I did not end up making notes.
Okay. Peel, do you actually want to try and... You're probably going to have to get on voice if you want to describe it, because for the audience at home, I'm afraid they're going to have to hear your dulcet tones. Are you going to not hit me now?
Oh, it would help you.
I can do Fukuyama, actually, because I did read Fukuyama, and then someone else needs to do Hayes. So Francis Fukuyama, in Our Post-Human Future, makes the argument that we probably shouldn't try and become post-human because it might be impossible, and even if it wasn't impossible, then it would be really bad because it would fundamentally change human nature, and that's bad because we wouldn't we don't value things that don't have human nature. And also it might mean that we would move away from liberal democratic systems, and that's what communists and the French Revolution and other horrible utopian projects tried to do. Does everybody agree with that summary? Have I missed anything?
He also hates the left.
It sounds like what I've heard of Fukuyama. That's all I can say on the matter.
Cool. So, Shadell, do you want to get on voice and tell us about
Sure.
Haley's?
Is my sound on okay?
Yep.
Your sound is fine.
Okay. So Hale's work, How We Became Post-Human, kind of tries to chart the history of the development of thought about cybernetics and about post-human, through both academic work in 3 periods, as well as literature and fiction, with the idea of kind of elucidating a number of concerns and dualities that have defined the debate and kind of served both. And I think there's a little bit of a tension here in that it's both kind of very literal, uploading our brains as an example she goes to often, but also kind of the dissolution of the modern human as an element of an analytic construct of the self. one central concern that repeats throughout the works, especially the chapters we read, is this notion of embodiment, and kind of what does that mean, and how does this challenge some of these ideas of more analytical thought, as well as the ideas like uploading ourselves to computers.
Yeah, so it felt like a lot of what I read of Hales was, like you said, about embodiment, which reminded me quite a bit of, I don't know how many of y'all got through Haraway's manifesto in the first reading, but the third breakdown she describes between the material and the, I'm not sure if it would be immaterial or virtual. I'm just going to go with virtual. I'm not quite sure whether this was meant to be pushback or an expansion on that breakdown, because it feels like it's sort of, on some levels, pushback against the very naive sense of, well, this is all breaking down into the virtual. There is nothing material left. But at the same time, it's also very literal breakdown of the idea that the material and the virtual are distinct in the first place. The material and the virtual, data is always embodied in a thing, but it is still virtual in a sense.
What
So,
a place where I think Hales does a kind of a good job with this is in, she's not necessarily taking a side in the way Fukuyama is, where Fukuyama is kind of has an axe to grind, it is making an argument. Hales is much more kind of trying to, I think, represent what the debates have been and how these debates have been structured and the range of thought.
I do think she does take a side. She mentions in chapter 6, I believe, that her goal here is she finds the post-human futures, which some describe to be nightmarish, because they remove the embodiedness of the human being. They reduce humans to merely a data pattern, and she finds that horrifying for various reasons, though she doesn't really go into those in detail. So what she's calling for, seems to be, well, she explicitly says, is a post-humanism which brings things back to the real embodied beings at hand. I think that's probably her thesis statement or her goal there.
Well, have you seen, for example, like chapter 10? Did you get through that?
No, I got most of the way through chapter 6. I almost finished it, but still had like 5 or 6 pages.
What she ends up doing in chapter 10 is she pulls out different exemplars of fiction and with very different takes on posthumanism.
Okay.
So she shows kind of, and they're both positive and negative takes, is what's kind of interesting. So she has 4 fictional works: Blood Music, Galatea 2.2, Snow Crash, and
Terminal Games, I think it was the 4th.
Terminal Games, yes, the one that sounded really bad. And kind of, so Blood Music, for example, talks about the dissolution of the body and kind of being decomposed into collectives of cells as a post-human future. That's kind of an optimistic take on this. Whereas Terminal Games is like, no, that's horror, that's nightmare. We need to be back human in our bodies. Any kind of like uploading or virtuality or collectivity is a huge problem.
Mm-hmm.
And then Galatea 2.2 deals with like machines becoming human and kind of using that to kind of juxtapose what humanity means, while Snow Crash deals with humans becoming machines, kind of downloading a virus that reduces people to automata.
Yeah.
So I think so. And I think this kind of highlights that she's a lot of it. What she's doing is kind of outlining the space and outlining that there are these concerns about embodiment and about ideas about embodiment. And I think she does have preferences here. You're right, but I think she is much more focused on kind of what is the idea space and how do people think about this. And so,
Yeah.
like, as if there's like a grand thesis here, I think it's kind of the chart she has on. Where's the page? Does anyone remember the whole weird diagram? This Jordan Peterson.
I'm
Which
looking for
one
it
is
as well.
she
I
has
don't
the
know what page
diagrams?
it's on.
Chapter 10, the one with the two
Oh,
axes.
yeah,
Yeah. Oh yeah, that one.
page 249 of the PDF.
Yeah. There's also one on the page right before that, but it's 249 is the main one.
Mhm.
So, like, I think this is kind of, as much as anything, kind of where she ends up in the end.
Okay.
So if anyone's struggling, just looking at this diagram should just make everything completely, perfectly understandable.
I
Oh,
don't
yes,
understand.
of course. Actually, this sort of reminds me of a take I had when I started reading, which is that this feels like it's very much in a dialogue with, or attempting to be in a dialogue with Haraway's system, which is interesting because she only mentions Haraway a couple of times. And so she's clearly read Haraway's work, right?
Yeah.
But she doesn't really seem to mention it very much, and she often doesn't mention it in reference to even ideas which are very related to what she's talking about. So the breakdown of the material and the virtual, the humans becoming machines, machines becoming human, etc. She doesn't bring Haraway up at all, even though Haraway is very relevant there.
I wish I got chapter 10. I think it's kind of interesting, like when she was talking about reflexivity, I thought that was very interesting compared to Fukuyama, because like Fukuyama also kind of talks about reflexivity, but he sort of talks about it like Fukuyama talks about like reflexivity as a very much as a negative kind of, like he has this, like there's one example in Fukuyama where he talks about like if we were to make a robot arm that was, like would just pull its like pull its hand away from the flame just because the flame, like because it had a heat sensor in the flame and didn't feel pain, that would replicate the thing of a human arm, but it wouldn't be in any way human. But the thing is, I feel like that sort of begs the question whether humans are then human, because like there's a lot like I think sorry, just going into comparing them now. I think the thing that I thought was really interesting about Fukuyama was kind of twofold. The first of all was that in order to defend his position, he adopts a kind of a quite a sort of quite like pop cultural almost view of humanity, like certainly a very narrow view of humanity, like human, basically that human embodiment and everything is all good, like this is the way it has to be. But also, and that like it kind of assumes that you're not having like a Peter Wattsian kind of view where like the consciousness and the thing is just like the surface level of the brain, and there's not a lot like there's not a lot of unseen processes in the body which are like inducing it. Yeah, exactly.
So I have
what
a bit of a reading on Fukuyama, which is flowing from his whole end of history thing. He thinks that he's got everything figured out, and now he's very worried about the possibility of new, human altering technology, sort of ripping the rug out from under him.
Yeah, no, I think that's a thing like that. I think is one of the really fascinating and kind of unexamined parts of the book, which is that the whole thesis of the book really requires you to like the end of history. Like, what if you don't like liberal democratic capitalism? Right? Like, Fukuyama sort of assumes that you are, like, you, the reader of this book, are like super happy with, with human whatever, right? With the current state of humanity, which he describes in this, actually, as Gravitas Free Zone, says rather mystical terms. You know, that there's this kind of an X factor of humanity which we don't know yet, and makes us human, right? And this also means that we will eventually get to liberal democracy. And the thing I think is so interesting about that is, like, well, that, I think, from when the hell was our post-human future written?
They both feel like very early aughts, just in
Yeah,
time. But
it was
I could be
written.
wrong
It
on
was
that.
originally published in 202, so assume it was written about 201.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what if you think that the end of history sucks? Like, what if you want to, like, his argument, even by his argument, even by his argument, like, you could say, well, what wouldn't a communist utopia be better? And if we have a problem with human nature as it is, why don't we just, like, build a like, even if you take his argument that, like, utopian societies are impossible because of human nature, that seems to me like a, well, okay, then let's make human nature suck less, right? And he can't really seem to get. He almost can't seem to get on him. Like, he almost can't seem to get on that. Like, the only thing that he can kind of think that people might want to alter in terms of human nature is make humans less aggressive. And I must admit that's something I care about very little. Like, I don't think human aggression is a particularly large problem in human society.
Where's
Like,
Sophia? Sophia needs to be here for this
Oh,
discussion.
yeah, the drama has been about take which touches on that in a way, I guess. Though, honestly, taken a bit out of context.
mhm.
But yeah. Are you suggesting Sophia would agree with Fukuyama's take?
I don't know that Sophia would necessarily agree with it, but I think it is an interesting point of potential convergence.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, I think Hales has some arguments that I think are kind of interesting in this vein. For one, because they're better, but for another, because so, like, and this is kind of one of the chapters we weren't assigned, but she talks a little bit about this. But this is kind of where I went to immediately with this discussion of embodiment. Is that thinking of, like, uploading or changing the human condition in some ways? So much of emotion is somatic. Like, arousal, physiological arousal, is an extremely embodied part of emotion and part of the human experience. In terms of even things like are people familiar with the idea of misattribution of arousal, or the suspension bridge effect, or anything like that?
I have.
I'm a
No.
few bars, like, so I don't think I am, but
So the idea is that if you can induce a state where people's, say, heart rate is elevated, where they're sweating, where the body is kind of in a highly aroused, not sexually, but like physiologically aroused state.
Yeah.
You can then introduce another stimulus, and people will attribute their arousal to that stimulus. So, for example, if you get people very scared by having them walk across, like, a rickety bridge over a tall ravine, and then have somebody ask for their number, they're much more likely to experience that as attraction, there, because their body is giving them the physiological cues for attraction, so that it becomes that emotion. And in terms of then thinking about the embodied nature of experience, you can get to, I think, then this idea of, well, we upload people. We take your entire cognition and your entire personality, and we reproduce it somehow faithfully in a machine. Well, I think in terms of this idea of kind of a human factor, or like an emergent property of being human, well, you've lost, to some extent, the very distinctly embodied aspects of emotion. If you just do that naively. And then
You basically have to simulate the entire body, not just the brain. And then fake input signals.
right. But then, so there's this idea then of the qualia of certain experience. And I think there are ways where you can then be like, well, we can just recreate the entire body in the Matrix, for example, or like a Matrix version of the body. But that seems to then downplay a lot of the idea of uploading us or changing our mode of existence.
Yeah, but you can change the mode of existence even without uploading. So you can, I don't know, cybernetics or genetic modification or stuff like that. So it isn't a binary yes or no proposition.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. But I think it is something that needs to be like evaluated and considered in this regard. That there are aspects of human experience that aren't easily reduced to the analytic. Which is, I think, where Fukuyama is trying to go at his best, and where Hales kinds of charts out an argument there that's a little bit clearer and stronger, I think.
So I think one of the more interesting things she cites is, the frog paper, which, in a way, sort of problematizes, as far as I can see, her own view of things.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting, actually.
Which
Sorry,
essentially,
for the people, because everybody's just tell us about it. Sorry.
So the idea is that they were messing around with neurons in frogs' brains and sort of seeing how they process visual input. And I think the core takeaway of that is that we don't have the sort of naive homunculin view where you're watching the world through the cameras that are your eyes. Rather, the brain takes the data from the eyes and then uses that to construct the world. You best start believing in a virtual reality because you're already in one.
Yeah. But at the same time, that sort of creates a context where I sort of agree with Hales' thesis in that I often find discussions of virtualizing the human, that is, uploading and the like, to lack a degree of rigor, whereas other forms of post-humanism, such as cyberization and the gradual replacement of organic with machinic parts, seems to be more based in actual science we know of rather than a hypothetical thing which we don't know exists or is feasible at this point. And so I think I agree with Hales on that account. I do find it interesting that you bring up the the perception of a thing and how it is primarily your brain that handles things, rather than like just your eyes processing information and giving it to you directly.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think. Sorry. Go.
Right. One thing I found problematic with Fukuyama's take is we've touched on this before slightly, but it's very rooted in his cultural sphere and the religious ideas of that cultural sphere, that humanity is special, that it was meant to be a certain way, and that to take it away from that is an act of hubris or even active evil.
So basically, the notion that humanity was created and then given this position of almost lordship over the world.
Yes, he
Very
never
culturally
comes out and
Christian.
says that or addresses it, but it seems very baked into his assumptions.
He
And
kind of
he's not self-reflective at all throughout the entire book, so he never brings that up. But
It's very lazy. I mean, it's because he basically says, well, you have this X factor, which I'm not going to define. I'm really not going to talk about it. And this is what makes us human. And, well, okay, so you haven't defined the factor, you haven't said that it's good or bad, you haven't proven anything. You just say this is the factor and this is desirable, and you're basically very much stopping any conversation, because you're saying that everything else that gets beyond this X factor or outside the sphere of this X factor is something that's inherently lesser, simply by being different, which is, I mean, it's problematic in a lot of ways, but first and foremost, it's very lazy. There is
I think it's
possibility for growth and of analysis.
Well, I think it's interesting in that when he kind of contracts or tries to contrast with ethics systems that don't rely on like an X factor, he seems almost unable to grasp that you could find some other basis for ethics. Like, he's talking about somebody in the human nature section, where he just says, well, they've eliminated arguments for, the person who talks about the gen rich. And he's like, well, they've eliminated human nature, so how can they argue against the gen rich then? And he just kind of presumes they can't without actually like unpacking their argument against it at all. He doesn't examine what they actually say there. He's just so dogmatically convinced that without an X factor, you can't arrive at something like that, that he rejects out of hand almost.
I think my issue is that when he says X factor, he means soul in the Christian sense, and he's just not brave or self-aware enough to come out and say that.
I mean, for me, it was also just like his argument is real. Like in terms of futurism, his argument really seems like it falls down. Like, what about orcas, right? Like, just to throw out an example, if like under Fukuyama's moral logic, if tomorrow we were to find that like orcas were sapient, right? You know that because like we've had trading relations with fucking orcas. So I don't think like it's not a particularly enormous stretch to say, okay, like orcas are sapient beings, right? They're still not going to be human, right? They're still not going to have whatever X factor it is that humans have. Are we then going to say that we grant humans these orcas no rights? Or what if if like aliens arrived, right? Like what if we, like went into space and we met aliens, right? Those are again, and they don't have the same human nature as us because I don't know they're like they evolved from like herd plant eaters who like involved intelligence to like detect like increasingly complex predator traps or something.
But it seems
Are we
likely
gonna
to me
say-
that under
Kind to Mr. Spock.
It's like Gravitastone says, it's very intellectually lazy. It's
It
not that
seems-
these questions can't be answered in this paradigm, because like the Catholic Church does actually have an answer to both of those questions, and the answer is yes, we should give them rights because they're people. So these questions can be answered, but he's not interested in even thinking about the question.
I mean, I think that kind of misses the point, though, right? Like, he's not answering those questions because he doesn't think the answer is relevant to the point that he's trying to make. And you can kind of disagree with that position, but I feel like Fukuyama's rejection of that particular point, as opposed to some other points where he's just sort of glossing them over, is understandable. I mean, you could see a situation in which Fukuyama basically finds aliens and goes, well, they got the Y factor.
Yeah, I
Right?
guess you can, but at the same time, it just like the problem. I think what this points to, Squishy, is because he doesn't really examine the X factor. Like the problem I have with his kind of X factor argument is he doesn't like. How do I put this? Like, why is this good? As Gravitas Free Zone was saying earlier, why, like, unless you're actually presuming that this is the supernatural element that like unless you're assuming like a supernatural element of a soul, which is then brings us onto a a different kind of argument.
Well,
Who cares to a certain extent? Like, I mean, okay, I will be less human. I don't really want to be human.
So what he argues is that the X factor is the proof for an X factor is the demand for human equality. So that if you were to strip away any contingent and accidental characteristic, there remains some essential human quality underneath that is worthy of a certain minimum level of respect. Call it factor X. So it's kind of so for him, it's the basis for presuming moral equality. All lives are created equal. Which he is explicit here. He does acknowledge that for Christians, this is the soul, and that's easy, and you're done. But then he's kind of like, and if you're not religious, you have Kant, because those are the two things: Kant or Christ. And for Kant, Kant says free will, but Fukuyama doesn't really buy free will, and then that's the end of that section.
And the thing is that where do you draw the boundary? So let's say free will. Let's say you go with our Lord and Prophet Kant. Where does free will derive from? Basically. So where do you draw if you have an AI or if you have an alien or if you have a post-human organism, a human-derived post-human organism, or I don't know, you have a parrot that's evolved over 10,000 or 10 million years, and they have free will. So do they have that X factor? Do they not have that X factor? Because Fukuyama, basically, he doesn't really put a boundary there. I mean, you have free will. Okay, let's define free will. You have a soul. Okay, let's get into a theological argument. What does that mean? Because he just says, well, there is this X factor, and it's unique, it's irreplaceable, but we never draw any lines on this X factor.
So that presupposes that humans have free will, which is a big if.
Well, and I mean, and I think
he challenges that. He is skeptical of that.
Yeah, Fukuyama does. He does.
But you have to define the X factor first. I mean, it may be free will, it may not be free will, but you have to try to do something.
You have to make a case for it. What it
is.
Let's
get back to what you said about intellectual laziness again, because, like other people have just said, this is an active question in psychology, which is one of my fields, and like the general state of said field is either we are all biological organisms are essentially robots, or more than just humans have free will. But because he doesn't engage with that's anything outside of his very small bubble again, or self-analyze, he just can't even begin to talk about it.
No,
I found the book very
Squishy's been trying to speak for like a minute. Like,
no,
sorry.
Go ahead. I was gonna. Yeah.
Sorry, just a meeting queue here. Yeah, no, you're up, Squishy. Go.
Oh yeah, no, I was just saying. So I think the thing about the free will is that he discards that argument, right? So he talks about free will. He says, well, maybe it's free will, and then he goes, but that doesn't make a lot of sense because there are people who deny the existence of free will, and the Kantian argument is kind of weak anyway. And
I find
no,
it
it's not free will. So what he then goes on to say is basically it's complicated, and he raises, I think, two particular reasons for the concept of human dignity, right? And he challenges both of them with this idea of posthumanism. So what he says in the first case is he says partly it's a force of habit, right? We see ourselves as a collective whole, whether that is historic, whether that has a religious basis, whether that has a cultural basis. We see ourselves as a collective group of individuals, and the force of habit just sort of creates this idea of human dignity. And the other option, and he sort of says that the two are interrelated, is that it's the product of human accident. Essentially, that it is a combination of history. We have sort of evaluated our history and looked at the bad people in our history, like the Nazis. Those are really bad people, and the Nazis rejected the idea of human dignity, and we hate those people, and therefore, we have accreted a historical collective belief that human dignity is important. And this, I think, goes back to his other. This, I think, is sort of the grounded basis of the criticism, which is that if you proceed to have sort of a human divergence, a human flowering, if you want to call it that, suddenly those things don't matter as much. Those things are less important. The idea of the force of habit of humanity becomes less important if you are not the same, if you are actually different than other people. Similarly, the whole idea of denying the horrors of Nazism and this and racial eugenics and all of those things become less important if you can point to yourself and go, I actually can shoot lasers out of my wrists and therefore I'm a better person. Right? So I think that is his approach to that thesis. I don't think it's about free will at all. Like, I think he brings up Kant only for the purpose of sort of throwing it away.
Yeah, he wants to reject it. He wants to kick that away.
Yeah, so I was actually just about to type this in chat, but I'll just say it here, since we seem to have gotten there. I feel like Kant got brought up without really understanding Kant. It's interesting that he got brought up as an argument for, like, an X factor, in that the X factor in Kant's thought would be not human nature itself, but the human ability to subjugate and transcend their own nature, if that makes sense.
Oh God, transcendental free will nonsense.
Yeah.
I think. See, the thing is, Squishy, I think that the thing that I think is so interesting about that argument, and this is what I think is the thing that I think is so interesting about Fukuyama as an academic and as a subject to be roasted on in transhumanist reading groups, is that especially when they're full of trans people, is that he doesn't really seem to that's a very white cishet male able kind of way of looking at the world, right? Like that we that all humans are that we need to preserve what is now, because otherwise we'll lose the idea that humans are intrinsically equipped with are intrinsically worthwhile and subject to dignity. Is it subject to dignity? I don't know. But the thing is, I mean, it was not. Yes,
I think arguably Fukuyama doesn't necessarily disagree with you either. Like, I think you may place more value on that interpretation, but I think it's not necessarily true that Fukuyama doesn't disagree with that. So Fukuyama basically says, yeah, it is true that today rich people get richer and they mate with other rich people, and like that things are not fundamentally equal. But what he says is the idea of a genetic lottery has an creates an equalizing factor, right? A social equalizing factor. So imagine a situation. So for example, to go back to what you were saying, today you could be rich and really powerful, and you could have a kid who turns out to be trans, right? And that could happen to anybody. That the genetic lottery means that could happen to anybody. We have sort of this scattering of traits. It is essentially the veil of ignorance. We have a veil of genetic ignorance. You must behave as if, and not everybody does, but the theory is you must behave as if your children could be anybody, because they could be anybody, right? They could be deaf. They could be trans. They could be gay. They could be short.
Yeah,
right?
but it hasn't really stopped the bigotry, for example.
Well, no,
I think
hasn't.
Fukuyama really overestimates this. The
Right,
impact
I
of the
guess
genetic lottery. I think he very much looks at it as a very, academic bubble, like reasonably wealthy first worlder academic bubble who is a bit progressive,
I think
and
you can
he thinks
definitely.
that. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, go ahead. Finish.
Just to finish, and I think he's very trapped in this paradigm that people are going to be reasonable and look at things in a reasonable intellectual way and value human rights and human dignity more than they value their prejudice. And he simply states this. He's very intrinsically convinced that this is universally true, and true even in first world countries, and it just isn't happening. I mean, he acts in a very narrow way.
So I think Fukuyama would respond in two ways to that. And one way is saying, yes, you're right, the world is not perfect, but the alternative I'm describing would be worse, right? That I agree 100% that the world is not perfect, and that therefore there is inequality and there continues to be inequality, and not everybody agrees about the concept of human dignity. But in a scenario in which people can choose what their children are like, where we don't have that genetic lottery, the situation would be 10 times worse. So I think that's one argument. I think the second argument, and maybe the weaker argument, is, and it depends sort of on what you think about it. I think the weaker argument essentially boils down to this idea that the end of history is kind of a misnomer, in that when he describes the end of history and he describes what he sees as sort of the ideal end state of society, I don't think he sees that as utopian. Right? I don't think Fukuyama's view of the end of history is that the end of history is a utopia. It is best, quote unquote, but not utopic in nature. There are flaws, and one of the flaws is this, right? One of the flaws is that bad things happen, bad people arise, not everybody agrees. That, yeah, you're right. Absolutely, he is conceiving of this idea sort of structurally as human dignity, but I think he acknowledges that that doesn't necessarily mean human dignity everywhere. And I do think you can criticize that by sort of saying he needs to put more weight on one or the other, right?
He is, in this sense, I think, kind of a new age Pangloss. This may not be perfect, but it's the best of all possible worlds.
Yeah.
Regardless of what actually happens. And that is, to a certain extent, a perspective born out of privilege.
I mean, it definitely is. I would 100% agree, and I don't even think he would necessarily disagree, right?
Well, I think the problem with the argument, well, then it could be worse. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you had the floor, I think. Or no? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the problem of like, well, it could be worse is that again, to a certain I think to a certain extent it could be worse is also to some extent an argument from privilege. Like, I'm not sure that you may be right. Fukuyama may not disagree with this, but like the problem with that kind of panglossic argument is like, well, what that again, like, worse for who, right? Like, the question of, do you actually believe that this is how do I put this? Like, I don't think a lot of people who are not, rich cishet academic guys would necessarily agree with the idea that like, this can be the best of all possible worlds, because the world sucks a hell of a lot more than for them. So I think that the real problem that I have with Fukuyama's argument is, yes, certainly without the genetic veil of ignorance, things could get worse. But on the other hand, it could also potentially be better, right? Because just arguing from Fukuyama's own premise, like, you can certainly disagree with a lot of the things of his premise, but what I thought was kind of the weakest part of the book was that he kind of treats, like, to a certain, although he treats the end of history non-utopianly, he kind of just allows him to. No, but the thing is, it requires. I'm not saying. Sorry, just reading you saying in the chat, Squishy. I'm not saying that it really requires it to be good for anyone, but if you're going to have a book which says you can escape the end of history by doing posthumanism, and you shouldn't do posthumanism, then that, I think, requires a level of desire to continue the end of history, which is, I think, a lot stronger than I would certainly experience.
Well, yeah,
And I think a lot stronger than a lot of people, like, in 2020 would possibly
well,
experience.
100%. I mean, I think there's two criticisms. One is that the end of history is not true, right? Like, it's
Yeah.
a disproven thesis at this point. But assuming that it was correct, his argument, I think, basically is that the end of history was not great, but the alternative is worse. The post-human alternative is worse. And I think you could disagree with that thesis as well, right? His argument is the genetic veil of ignorance is extremely important, because the alternative to the genetic veil of ignorance is that things get worse. Like, you see the rise of a genetic overclass. You might disagree with that thesis, right? But like, I think it is tied to the concept of the end of history. And I think part of it is that it's tied to the concept of the end of history as like a liberal democratic regime that is fundamentally not anarchistic, right? If your idea of a better history, or a better end of history, if your idea of the better future is one that is less liberal democratic statist and more anarchistic, obviously a scenario in which people diverge more is beneficial to you. But from Fukuyama's perspective, where fundamentally liberal democracy is an exercise in institutionalism, this idea that people might diverge into some sort of anarchist model is itself fundamentally problematic, right? So I think it goes back to some of those underlying value judgments about why the end of history was a good thing. And you don't have to agree with them, right? Like, obviously, you can make the argument, one, that the end of history is wrong because it just didn't happen. But you can also make the argument the end of history is wrong because the values that he chose as sort of the ultimate development of history are not for everyone, right?
I feel like often when we talk about how people who try to reify the currently existing system, there's this fear that if you try a different system, that's going to end up leading to use a provocative word, a degeneracy of the systems at play in general. That is to say, not necessarily a degeneracy in the perverse term of perversions, but in the sense that the systems need to be maintained, or the breakdown will lead to something which is less optimal inherently. And it feels like that's part of what Fukuyama is arguing, is that, well, there's this potential here for a different future, but if we follow through with it, then that could cause the breakdown of the systems which currently exist. So it's a very conservative sort of positioning. Does that make sense?
Well, for Fukuyama, the system we have right now is the natural product of our brains. But if you change people's brains, which is what this new technology could enable us to do, then the system, which is downhill from that, will also change, and that worries Fukuyama.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's very, from what I'm hearing, worried about becoming something different than he believes the system to already be, right? If human becomes fluid, then his argument for the current system as an aspect of human nature just sort of disappears as well. Becomes fluid, becomes immaterial. It's something he has to sort of argue against, because, well, otherwise, what is he even doing? But it's not something I think you really can argue against easily, without, as he does, writing a bunch of stuff off and using cheap rhetorical tricks like bringing it up, not really addressing it, and discarding it. Does that make sense, or am I like completely off base?
It sounds right to me, particularly that the core of Fukuyama's objection to posthumanism, transhumanism, everything is fear and fear of change. And again, going back to Gravitas Free Zone's comment that it's intellectually lazy and he's not engaging with his own fear, he's not engaging with his own internality at all, because he thinks he doesn't have one.
Sorry, just coming back now. I think the other thing that I would kind of dispute about Fukuyama, like hearing your argument on him, Squishy, is I think that I think I actually do disagree with the idea that a genetic veil of ignorance is really important. Because the thing is, I think Fukuyama perhaps has a somewhat 2000s-y view of where oppression comes from. Like, I feel like, I think that the thing that people kind of assumed in 2000 a lot more than perhaps they do now, because everyone is, actually everybody has been brought out of their bubble a lot more than they had. They thought that, am I still on? Can people still hear me? Sorry.
Vaguely,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Can someone say something? Okay.
Yes, we can
Cool.
hear you.
Yeah.
I think that cool. I think that the thing that the problem I have with the argument about a genetic veil of ignorance is, well, I don't really think a genetic veil of ignorance actually kind of stops people from stops people from like abusing one another that much. Like, yeah, your kid could be trans, but you could also kick him out of the house. And I guess I also don't really think that intelligence is actually, like, this is actually the other thing where I probably have a quite controversial opinion that disagrees with Fukuyama, which is I don't really believe that our system is meritocratic. And I don't really believe that intelligence actually has that much to do with success.
Fukuyama believes that at all.
Let's be clear here. Meritocratic is a terrible word. It makes no sense. It combines a Latin root with a Greek root. The correct word is aristocratic.
Okay, sure, but like, I mean, maybe he doesn't actually believe that. But then, whither cometh the genetic overlords, right? Like, you can't. I mean, okay, sure, you can say people will have superior capacity, but that is not necessarily going to be create. That is not necessarily going to turn into a social function. Squishy.
Like, so I don't know that necessarily. I don't know that I think that Fukuyama necessarily believes in a meritocratic society. In fact, I think he arguably would take the opposite position, which is basically that there is already a scenario in which people think themselves lucky, right? Like, so he says at one point something along the lines of, and you could disagree with this, and I really do disagree with it, but he says something along the lines of, bright and successful people today believe they owe their success to accidents of birth and upbringing, and they feel themselves to be lucky, and therefore they have a concept of noblesse oblige, right? And you can 100% disagree with that, with that position, because I think it's total bullshit. But like, it seems clear to me that he does not, that he is not necessarily arguing that success is the basis of merit. And arguably that's why he wants the veil of genetic ignorance in the first place. I think. Because I think what he would say is that without a genetic veil of ignorance, essentially you have rich people who didn't get there on the basis of merit, genetically engineering their children to be supermen, and therefore sustaining what was essentially an accident. I think that's what he would say.
At the same time, that same framework is already in existence in a lot of ways. So
yeah, no, I
there's
agree.
And engaging
I mean,
fully
think
with
the
that point would
question-
kind of take us away from the talking about transhumanism to talking about political philosophy in general. But is the
I think,
big
I
thing with
guess what I'm saying,
transhumanism is that
Squishy, is that
physical
I'm not
changes.
necessarily.
Sorry, FBH.
No, you first. You were talking.
Is the one big thing with transhumanism is that becoming a genetically altered Superman or a cyberized Superwoman or whatever transhuman you want to be doesn't actually give you that much power. Like, the power of those rich kids is not improved by them becoming genetic superhumans, as you said. That doesn't matter. What matters is the social power they were born with because of who their parents were.
Yeah,
which is
that's what
totally
I'm
unconnected
getting
to
at.
any idea of transhumanism.
Right. I
That's
think
kind of
there's-
what I'm getting at in terms of meritocracy, because it's. Sorry.
No, go on.
Stepping on people. Like,
Go on.
the thing is, like, you kind of like, yeah, you know, like, yes, obviously, like, we do not want, like, obviously, I don't want the rich to be able to, like, turn themselves into vampires, right? You know, like, literal vampires or blindsight vampires, or, you know, I think, like, the genetic engineering of the rich is a thing that we should resist. Because they might grant themselves greater, you know, like, they may be able to find them a way to grant themselves greater capacity. It may make them more difficult to get rid of, etc., etc. But I don't necessarily think. I think that that certainly Fukuyama would need to examine a lot more what he, you know, like, what does that really mean in practice, right? Because, like, why is that necessarily, like, considering also he doesn't, like, he seems actually quite skeptical about the technology of posthumanism. I think that it certainly requires a lot more argument than just the rich would make themselves genetic super people and that's bad, especially considering he's talking about state regulation where you could just do it, like, where, you know, you could just go, okay, well, we're just going to make it so that any, like, if there's augmentation, technology, then everyone gets it, right? As opposed to no one gets it.
Well, he does do that. So he goes beyond the argument that the rich will make themselves genetic superhumans and that's bad, to specifically say the reason that is bad, in Fukuyama's opinion, is not just because the rich will actually be smarter than everybody else, right? That might be a consequence, but that's not really what he seems to object to. What he seems to object to, basically, is that the rich will make themselves into genetic supermen, and they will then use that power. They will then take that they will then enshrine that social power to make to make themselves fundamentally an overclass.
Okay,
right? So they're not going to be better because they're
two
smarter. They're
things
going to be
there,
better
though,
because they're
Squishy.
going to be better because they've sort of lifted themselves into a class above the rest of people, right?
Okay, but the two things there. One, they already have. Two, genetic engineering won't help them do that.
Well, so yeah, I mean, okay, so you could disagree, and his position is they haven't already done that. But, you don't have to agree with that. And I think that's probably the flaw of the end. That's one of the major flaws of the end of history, right? This idea that in fact the liberal democratic state that he believes exists in the law in the end of history is egalitarian is probably one of its strongest flaws as a thesis, right? But
yeah, I mean, the thing is, the liberal democratic state kind of wants to be authoritarian, but it has no real idea of how to be egalitarian. Like, I mean, I think to a certain extent that's also to somewhat I think that's also to somewhat like a very kind of American view, because I mean, because like inherited wealth is actually a bit like empirically inherited wealth is a bit less important in America. Like this was one of the things that Piketty found. But yeah,
I think we have shifted slightly from the point that I was worried that we would once we got into this aspect of Fukuyama. Is we've shifted from talking about transhumanism to political philosophy.
Yeah. Okay.
I think I think one of the problems in I was going to say I think one of the problems in talking about the Hales thing in particular is that Hales is very, very one of the advantages of Fukuyama's work is that it's relatively straightforward, right? You could agree with it or disagree with it, argue that he has insufficiently supported his thesis, but it is generally written in sort of a fairly straightforward fashion. I find Hales much more difficult to figure out what exactly the thesis is and what exactly she's trying to.
I mean, a lot of Hales is like her basically summarizing for you. Like a lot of it kind of serves as a history book about like what is what have been some of these debates about transhumanism or posthumanism. Like where she kind of starts is like looking at Morvanic. Is that how you pronounce Morvanic? Brain upload robot guy, going once, going twice. Okay, it's going to be Morvanic from now on. I'm probably butchering this name. But like him talking about how you could have like a robot surgeon, like uploading your brain into a robot and finding your consciousness had not changed, and she was horrified by this, right? Because she thinks it doesn't there is no basically her like the thesis of the first chapter is that there is no strong separation between brain and body, right? The idea that your mind exists as a separate thing from your body is like not actually very good. Like you can't actually Moravec. Yeah. I don't know where the middle syllable came through in my mispronunciation, but and that's bad, which I think could also be sort of criticized because again, it kind of assumes that you're basically happy with the condition that you are in at the moment, right? Like not to get into all like self-hatred here, but like it assumes that you are basically happy with your condition mentally and physically. So you might like you can say, well, what if I want to heavily modify my current condition. But like that's kind of where she's coming from. That like, embodiment is, you are not like embodiment, and also like the kind of broad strata of social stuff around you. Yeah, exactly. But basically, I mean, her like the thing that I was thought of a lot when I was reading is, are you all like, there was, I remember reading a program about why solitary confinement is torture. And then talking about how it's actually kind of spooky because it kind of shows that the human mind is not actually does not have like this kind of strong separation from other human minds that we often assume it does. And I kind of thought about that a lot when I was reading Hayes because, yeah, I think it was. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was a Philosophy Tube video. But I think that like one of the things that is interesting about it is it's sort of it like, and basically what she's saying is that we all contain multitudes, and also those multitudes are not actually contained, right? We are all we are not like the what we like commonly think of as the exterior is not really the exterior, right? We are all already post-human selves, right? Because we exist within states, we exist within like cybernetic systems of interaction with people, and like even internally, we aren't really oneself. Like I am not, like I am not really me. I am in fact a set of agents within a like a cell of like I am basically a collectivity of cells which has decided to work with one another.
That's interesting. That's an interesting thesis because I would argue you are not a sorry, you're not a collectivity of cells. The agent hypothesis, I would say, is much more likely to be almost like programs, almost like sort of
well
super straight programming. So and I'll give you an example of what I mean by that, right? So you as a individual, I would argue, are essentially a combination of subroutines. You have your visual processing subroutine, right? Which really is we think of our eyes, we think of our visual processing system as cameras and looking at a screen, right? That there is no sort of active processing going on there. But I mean, I think evidence has suggested that's totally incorrect. That the visual processing subroutine in the human brain is enormously complicated and is enormously transformative in the sense that it creates the reality we perceive more than it just transmits the reality we perceive to us. In a similar way, if you take a tool, hold on, just give me a second. If you pick up a tool, your brain begins to incorporate the idea of the tool into yourself, right? You get a screwdriver, suddenly you don't have to be looking at where the screwdriver is to know where the screwdriver is, right? It becomes a part of your body. And so I think you have this idea that we are really almost sort of the emergent property of a set of really, really complex pseudo-sentient subroutines that do different things
This kind of reminds me of there's experiments that they ran on people where they had essentially cut the bit of nerve separating the two halves of the brain and had them draw something and then had them describe or say why they had drawn it, because I believe, if I'm remembering the experiment correctly, the half of the brain that handles that part of like the handle, or at least whatever hand they're using for drawing, is on the other half from this part that does speech. And essentially, they would not be able to explain why they had drawn what they had drawn, because that part of the brain controlling speaking could not communicate with the part that actually done the drawing.
Yes, both. If you have an encephalopathy, might be the term. I can't remember the term, but if you have that medical procedure to deal with seizures, then all the evidence points to the half of your brain that can no longer communicate with the outside world still being fully conscious. Yes.
Well, that's mildly horrifying.
Well,
Yes,
it
it
is
is. It's
my
really
it is
weird.
horrifying, but it kind of suggests that this idea of like if you look at it from a transhuman perspective, you say to yourself, what does that say about the addition of additional modules, additional consciousness modules? Call them that, right? Suddenly, we think of ourselves as sort of a very limited, maybe genetically derived, but you can imagine this idea of, rather than separating out the parts of the brain and therefore seeing them have sort of independent consciousness, adding in additional parts of the brain or parts of the consciousness and just sort of incorporating them into the self. How would that behave?
Well, I mean, people are already doing that to a certain extent. Like, I mean, there's a lot of grinder stuff. Like, are you guys familiar with the grinder like magnetic sense thing?
Yeah. The one, the magnetic ball bearing implanted in the finger to sense
Yeah.
electric currents and magnetic fields.
Yeah, and there's a couple of others. Like, I think they're all tactile rather than like direct brain interface. But okay, so basically, grinders are sorry, for people who is not familiar, and for people on the for those listening at home, grinders are like biohackers, right? They are all, that's what they call themselves. So they're people who are doing like basic transhumanism now, right? And one of the things they do in terms of like implant stuff is like trying to implant like extra senses. And one of the things that they do is they will like implant tiny magnets in the fingers so that you can actually kind of feel that, like, and then you can use, like that gives you effectively like a magnetic sense, and you feel where wires are and stuff like that. I've always worried that if I did that, it would like it would be too powerful and I would mess my computer up, but that's because like my cybernetic limb is the laptop in front of me more than anything.
Yeah. I do think the discussion of, okay, so when we talk about adding new modules into the brain and potentially adding new modules and eventually replacing old modules, that brings up a very Ship of Theseus sort of position on posthumanism, which I think I generally agree with, as opposed to the
Moravec. Sorry, not to cut across you.
Yeah, I had something I was thinking of, but now it's slipped my brain. Right, so yeah, I should add some more modules. Better short-term memory module, but I wonder what that would look like in actual practice. Do we
Well, so I think that's a fascinating question. I think one of the things about that question that is most fascinating is I think people imagine fundamentally that it would make them a very different person. But so I was having a discussion with somebody else about your past self, right? And your future self. We don't necessarily think this way, but it is, I think, on reflection, probably likely that people think their past and future selves are much more alien, are very alien. If you look at the decisions your past self has made, you look at the things your past self thought, you realize that you're not very much like your past self at all. You share some things, you share the experiences you experienced up to the time of that divergence, but the two yous are quite distinct. And in a similar way, I think we think of ourselves as the addition or subtraction of modules might make a significant difference, but I don't know that it necessarily would. Imagine, for example, that you went blind. You were struck with a disease or something that caused you to lose your sight. What does that say? That's a significant module of your cognition. What does it say that you have lost that? Alternatively, I mean, FBH was talking about the laptop, right? But I think you can make a good argument that is true, that the addition of always connected portable devices, smartphones, has in fact created sort of an additional module to our cognition. We have offloaded very specific processing tasks, memory retention tasks, mathematical processing tasks. We have offloaded a lot of those tasks to external modules of our cognition, and it has dramatically changed how we behave. We may not think that we are necessarily different people, but compare yourself perhaps today with yourself of 20 years ago, depending on how old you are, when smartphones were not ubiquitous, and say to yourself, is your today self really not an alien compared to your 20-year-old self or 20-year younger self?
There's two interesting things that raises for me. Is one, memories are almost entirely constructed. So, like, even thinking back to that far, you're not actually interacting with the mental state that you had back then. You're imagining what your old mental state was like. But also, it makes me think of individual difference, because there are, and particularly the idea that people brought up of like adding and subtracting modules, because there is an individual difference within, the aggregate humanity of senses. Is like I and a few other people can hear electric fields. It's a very high-pitched buzzing, and you get from the wires in the house, and it's incredibly annoying, actually. But like that is a thing that is a relatively rare ability in humans, and then you have, like you said, blindness, but also like color blindness as well. It's that individual difference, and the idea of that being customizable is a very interesting one. I think you're right that it's a bit strange to view it as making you less or more to be able to add and subtract these.
A similar thing that maybe more people have experience with is just learning a new language, or just because like if you know English but not like say Mandarin and you visit China, you will not be able to read basically anything. But then your experience of that place is going to be pretty different than if you were able to read everything that you saw.
Yeah, and if you... There we've got the question of, is learning a new language, can the act of learning a thing fundamentally change the underlying nature, I suppose, of who we are as a person? Because
Yes.
obviously we can add more...
Well,
we can learn more languages, we can learn...
does it even make sense to ask the question of an underlying nature of who we are as a person in the first place?
True. Yeah, that's fair.
I mean, I always found. I mean, I possibly had I think I'm a bit older than most people here, and I had a pretty different maybe had a quite different university experience. But I found like university a very sort of transhuman experience in that it was very mind expanding. Like it sort of teaches you it taught me ways of thinking about the world and examining the world, which I had previously not really even envisioned. So I don't really think the person I was when I went to university was the same as the person I was when I left university, for instance. And certainly I don't think they're the same as the person I am now. So I mean the question is, because like the brain kind of, as you say, memories are mostly constructed. Like the brain sort of tricks you into thinking that you are in fact a continuous, like a continuous being. But does that really make a great deal? Like, does that really make a great deal of sense in terms of a way to actually think about yourself in reality? I mean, you can say, well, you kind of have to because you need to get food and stuff. But at the same time, I'm not sure it like really makes philosophical sense to do so, because you kind of aren't, right? Like, I mean, memories are mostly constructed. Like, I don't remember most of the stuff that I did yesterday, for instance. Like I have a sort of Cliff Notes version. Like, your memory is not really your memory is in reality is not how your memory is remembered. How your memory presents itself to your conscious mind.
Well, but what does that even mean? And I think maybe that's a different question. What does that even mean? We think to ourselves that, so yeah, the idea that memory is constructed arguably means that the memory you envision today is not what you experienced 100 years, or not 100 years ago, 100 days ago, whatever you want to say. But at the same time, what you experienced 100 days ago is arguably just as constructed. Right? Neither is an objective perception of reality to the extent such a thing even exists, which is debatable, right? But neither is the reality you see today. And I think that's the other thing. The memory. So did anybody ever read that Isaac Asimov novel about, or short story about the thing that looks into the past? I'm trying to remember what it's called. Okay, but basically what it was is it's a short story in which this guy invents a machine that can see into the past. Okay, and the government comes around and tries to like spend a huge amount of effort shutting him down, and he doesn't understand why this is the case. It's called like the chronoscope, and eventually, and he thinks they're just like protecting big business and all kinds of other things, and eventually he manages to spread the chronoscope all across the world to everybody. And the government is like, man, you fucked us all. Because what he didn't immediately realize was that the past is just now. Right? The past is now. The past is, we think of the past as being then, but the past is also now. And the chronoscope, sure, could be used to look into the past, but it could also be used to like spy on people right now. You just look at them a millisecond into the past. That's just right now. And and on that, in that vein, when I was in law school, my first year in crim class, we had a experience where the professor wanted to criticize eyewitness evidence. And so what happened was he set up this little thing where a couple kids get into a scuffle, a loud, audible scuffle at the side of the classroom, and then run out of the classroom. And the first thing he asks is, I want you to write down exactly what you saw to everybody in the class. Give me 100 words on what you saw. How many people? And then he brought them back in, right? He brought the students back in. How many people could got a reasonable idea of what they were wearing? And the answer is nobody. Nobody got a good idea of what they were wearing. The memory, it's not even so much a question of memory as it is perception, right?
Yeah.
So I think that in and of itself is a.
Yeah. Are you guys aware of the Mickey Mouse test? Sorry, on a sort of similar vein.
The Mickey Mouse test.
The Mickey Mouse test.
Sorry, but I can't remember what it's actually called. But basically, you have a film, right? Which has a series of you tell people you're going to watch a film of volleyball, and you need to count how many passes are made, right?
Is there a gorilla and not Mickey Mouse?
I've seen this with the gorilla or Mickey Mouse, but basically, at some point in the video, someone will walk across the thing in a gorilla suit or a Mickey Mouse outfit or something like that, right? Almost nobody actually remembers it. Like, and like in general, your brain, like, especially when you're reading, also, like, I remember when I was reading this one book on basically the psychology of intelligence analysis, which is on the CIA website if you ever want to read it. It's actually really interesting. But there was a part about how people see what they want to see, where they produced basically a bunch of like commonly known phrases with the words like doubled, right? So it was like a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, and they would write like two like twice. And because I was both tired and dyslexic, this was one of the biggest mindfucks of my life, because I actually looked at this and I actually could not see what was wrong with this stuff, even when they had told me that what they had done. And I was just blown away by this. Like the human mind is actually like the human perceptual thing and mind are actually really bad in certain respects. Like they don't report an accurate reality at all a lot of the time.
Yeah,
Well,
there
that sort
was.
of
Okay, go
that
ahead.
sort of spins back into what I said before, that we don't so much perceive reality as construct it within our brains.
I mean, that was the frog thing, right?
Yep.
I mean, it's more than just for like frogs. It was like particular to like fast moving, slow moving objects, but
Well, the idea of
Um,
like foreground and background is exactly where that comes from. Yeah, this is the frog thing.
yeah,
hmm.
it just it's basically what are you paying attention to, and everything else is sort of like nope, your brain's not going to remember that. It's not going to worth storing, and so you have to rebuild it after the fact.
Well, I mean, and also there's stuff like target fixation.
Mhm.
Is everybody aware of target fixation?
Hmm.
Cool.
Well,
I
even
think
presuming everyone here is familiar with target
Okay.
fixation, if we're
Yeah.
sharing this, then
Sure. Okay, so target fixation is generally, or at least I know it from air combat because it's a big thing in air combat. If you have
did you cut out there? Hello?
I don't know what's going on. FPH appears to have disappeared.
Hello?
It says FBH is still talking, but I can't hear anything.
Doesn't even say that they're talking on my end, just that they're still online.
because
Okay.
yeah.
So we totally missed everything that you just said, FBH.
Yeah, no, sorry.
Your
I
internet
I
cut out or
just saw
something.
my everything, my whole and everything around it reset. So just give me 1 second. I'll be right back.
Okay. Yay, internet connectivity issues. It happens.
Sorry, I'm not more participant. Lack of sleep is kind of getting me.
Yeah.
I was sorely tempted to dip just so I could have a nap.
A nap.
Yeah. So I think while we're waiting for FBH to get back,
Hi.
oh, hello.
Hello.
I don't know what the heck happened there.
Rip, 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 rip.
Yep.
So
So target fixation is what you were talking about, I believe.
yeah, target fixation. So if you are a fighter pilot, right, and you see below you an enemy bomber, let's say, can everybody still hear me? Cool.
Yeah.
So you see below you an enemy bomber, and you're a Second World War fighter pilot. So you have to dive in with guns, right? So you see the enemy bomber, and you see the enemy bomber, and you see the enemy bomber, and you don't see the escort fighter, which is coming in behind you. Right. This is a phenomenon called target fixation, and because your perceptual field kind of cuts out all of the stuff that doesn't seem relevant. Yeah, right, to it. And this is why you have like wingmen in air combat, right? Because someone basically has to not look at the target; they have to just be like looking for other stuff.
Mhm.
So much for the post-human future, Appeal. What do you mean by that? Have we gone off thing, or is it just my connection is bad?
Yeah, I think it's just a meme about the connection being bad.
I know what the heck is up with my connection at the moment.
On the topic of like perception errors, and this actually kind of links back into the reflexivity that Hales is bringing up, and about about a system observing itself. So like and how our own observations of how we
Machine
think
like
and
that.
whatnot, they don't run into the same perception issues, but they do run into perception issues of how what you're basically making a model of who you are, which isn't necessarily accurate to how you actually work.
Hmm.
Yeah, I found the reflexivity conversation or segment interesting. I'm assuming there's not another reflexivity segment later in.
There's just chapter 6, I believe.
Yeah, just in chapter 6. Okay. It's pretty interesting because it seems to parallel a lot of work that was done by the CCRU, especially the concept of hyperstition, but where hyperstition is more cultic almost. Basically, the idea of a hyperstition is an idea that brings itself into existence. This seems a little bit more grounded than that. But it's still basically talking about the same thing. So the reflexivity is a system which creates the conditions for itself, compared to hyperstition, which is an idea that bootstraps itself into being a thing. I find that idea of reflexivity as we are already part of the system. Observing the system makes us a part of it, and we can't really disentangle ourselves from what we are observing. And that makes us always already part of the process. Has an interesting overtone when you're a little more familiar with the accelerationist sort of analysis, because it feels very like something coming at the same ideas from possibly a different angle.
I think when we're talking about this, something that stuck with me is that, Halus seems very concerned about, the virtualization of human consciousness, which is a threshold that we haven't reached yet. Because while, as much as she rebels against the meme, we consider the brain as essentially a computer made out of delicious meat. It can't do a bunch of things that, computers can do right now, which is you can't take a thought from one brain and put it into another.
Yeah.
Why can't you?
Primarily because we don't have
right now,
brain-to-brain connectivity.
Let's put that a different way. What does it mean to take a thought from one brain and put it into another?
Well, I suppose that depends on how we're looking at it. If we're looking at it as a technical problem of synapses connecting from one point to another, then obviously we do not have a direct connection where the synapses of two brains meet. But if we're looking at it in terms of sharing ideas, the issue stops being one of there not being a direct synaptic connection, and becomes basically just the flaw of information is okay. Not sure if this is from the work itself, but basically information theory talks about like a framework, and I think this is in Hales, but I could be wrong. I could have read it somewhere else and just be misattributing it to Hales right now. Information theory is like a framework where you talk about this something as an information as ideas and the like, which are taken from one person, one entity, one mind, encoded and transmitted through some media to another person, entity, mind, etc. And so the issue then becomes the process not only of encoding and decoding, as Shadell just mentioned in the text chat, but also of signal versus noise. So there is always inherently going to be some corruption of the signal in the process of transmission due to media not being able to always fully encapsulate the thoughts, and there being other things that come along with. So even when you're talking, there's going to be a level of signal versus noise that influences how well your ideas are basically shared. And yeah, I think this could be brought around to the recent drama in a fun manner, but let's just ignore that and sidle slowly away from it because I don't want that to take over here really right now. But it's, yeah.
Well, the promise of a lot of this transhumanism is to speaking to what FBH was saying, is that instead of transmitting our ideas from language, we are essentially a set of programs running on that aforementioned delicious meat. And the promise of certain strains of transhumanism is to take those programs and run them somewhere else. Maybe that's a computer, maybe that's someone else's delicious meat.
One of the issues, since you brought up language, is that a lot of people think in language. I sometimes think in language, but you don't. Language is not the only way to think. It is language itself is a medium for thought rather than just a pure expression of thought, right?
And in contrast to that, at my peak of being able to, work in 3 different languages, in this case it was German, Japanese, and English, no matter what I was saying, I was basically sort of constructing a thought that I wanted to say, and then assembling it in the language I intended to use. And when I noticed that, it was a revelatory moment. It's like, holy shit, it's supposed to be like what trilingual people feel like all the time.
Yeah, and to some extent, okay, so that brings up an interesting point, which is that I have tried to teach myself other languages. I have not so far succeeded in teaching myself anything but enough Spanish to order a cup of coffee, or to ask where the bathroom is, etc. Very, very rudimentary grasp. But language and thought do have an interrelativity where the concepts can be related to the words in a language. But then when you're focusing on these concepts and ideas, oftentimes the act of creating new terms, new languages, changes how you can think about these ideas. So it's not even like necessarily directly a one-way relationship. Learning new languages doesn't just allow you to encode ideas in a different way, it allows you to grasp and form new ideas in some ways. Yeah. I don't know. Is that completely off base? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
No thoughts. Head empty. Brains move.
Hmm.
Well, if we're talking about language, how much of our consciousness is not understood through language or processed through language?
I mean, a good personal example there is trying to solve, like, because I work on a 3D engine for work, and so sometimes when I'm trying to work on something, it's like, okay, how does this object move, or how is it located? And oftentimes, like, those thoughts are not in any sort of language at all. It's in purely like somewhere like pseudo abstract, pseudo concrete terms. Like, I don't say, okay, this cube goes here. I just imagine the cube and where it ends up. And so that part is no language is involved there. In fact, when I try to explain it to someone else, I run into many issues because it's language is not very well developed designed for that.
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting point that, sort of got brought up in chat, though obliquely. When we consider thought, oftentimes we treat thought as being like identical between people, but in actuality, people think differently. And I don't mean just like in the sense that we have different frameworks. I mean like visual thinking versus, I guess, audiolingual thinking, for example, where some people have very visual thoughts. They think in terms of things they can see, and it's like they literally visualize things, right?
Like me.
Whereas, on the other hand, you have people who think more audiolingually. When they think, they're thinking in words, in sentences, and the like. Then you have other forms of thought entirely. Like, I generally don't think visually. I can make myself think visually because I sort of tried training myself to, but it's not my natural way of thinking to the extent that it's a quote unquote natural thing to think in one way or another. I tend to think sometimes audiolingually and sometimes I guess I'm gonna say conceptually, but that's a little bit off perhaps. It's an idea that is a concept that I haven't really put to words yet. I don't know, that's maybe a little bit awkward as a way of stating it. But like I'm sure other people here can relate, right? Like either to one side or the other. I'm sure we've got a few visual thinkers here as well. No?
I'm primarily a visual thinker as well. I like when I'm doing math or trying to solve problems, I literally imagine like a problem that or a visual problem that helps me, analyze the situation. Like for example, if I'm solving a math problem, I'm oftentimes literally in my head moving around the numbers to solve the algebra equation.
Hmm.
I mean, it's not like a pick up and visually move it, but I draw connections based off of like me moving about.
Mhm.
It was like it took years and years to realize that the way mathematicians actually write it isn't moving something from one side of the equation to the other. It was adding to both sides, or subtracting, or dividing, or multiplying.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
I just always saw it as a move operation.
Okay, yeah. One other thing on the subject of like modes of thought, ways of seeing and conceptualizing things is there are other ways of doing it. Like, is spatial thought, like thinking in 3D, is that a way of visual thinking, or is that a different way of thinking altogether?
I would argue that's a form of visual thinking. But I mean, you could argue the spatial component, depending on how you do it, is different. If you're thinking spatially in terms of like relative to your position, that might be a little bit different. But if you do like, if you ever take that and sort of do an overhead view or sort of rotate it in your mind, definitely on the visual end.
Yeah, and then when it comes to like new concepts, new ways of thinking, you can definitely learn and teach yourself to think in new ways. It makes me wonder what it would look like trying to teach yourself to think not just to speak a language, but to think in a different language, or to, in the case of visualization, teach yourself to think visually, because personally I struggled with teaching myself visual thinking a bit, and I'm still not very good at it. But I can actually, like, when I see an object in the real world, I can imagine rotating it and manipulating it in space without much issue. But I don't really, like, visualize an image of it in my mind. I have to see the image of it there.
On the other hand, would you be able to visualize something the way a mantis shrimp would visualize it? No matter how hard you tried, I don't think you could do that unless you had those senses.
Yeah, because they've got entirely different senses altogether, right? They've got different sense of sight, and they've got a different brain that processes what they see differently.
And the mantis shrimp is sort of famous in certain circles because, we have, 3 different cone cells and they have 12. So, imagine a color that you can't even imagine and then do that 8 more times, and that is how the mantis shrimp do.
Yeah, but then that is also sort of an anthropization of the mantis shrimp, because it presumes that, well, as was talked about earlier, the eyes are just video circuits that transmit a complete image to the brain, whereas the brain has work in processing, right? So them having these other cones doesn't mean they see like us, but with more colors. It could mean something else entirely, and they could have an entirely different way of seeing.
Well, I mean, do we even have any evidence to suggest that the way I perceive sight qualitatively, in terms of qualia, is how anyone else perceives sight or color or anything like that? Like if we were to upload my thoughts and translate and boop them into Vindictus's brain, is there any reason to assume that it wouldn't just be incomprehensible garbage without a medium that we know is communicable?
Yeah. So that brings up the idea that our own thoughts could be quite alien, even within the same species. So Fidel's thoughts would be alien to my modes of thinking and seeing. My modes of thinking and seeing would be alien to Shadell. And so even if we were to suppose like a sort of synaptic bridge some sort of direct connection between brains. It might not necessarily lead to the thought transmitting directly, because there would have to be sort of training and acclimation between the two
Well,
brains and their ways of conceptualizing things.
Well,
you
not
can have a sort of translation, which is what language is ultimately. So you can have a
Yeah.
process throughout which they're basically put in the same format, so to speak. And
Yeah,
then you
and so at
can
that
have
point,
Right. So you need a process of encoding and
exactly.
decoding.
yeah, so at that point, is there a difference end result between the existing processes of encoding and decoding and a sort of synaptic process
So
of
like
encoding
that
and decoding?
kind of
Well, I mean, I think you could transmit a lot more, for example. Like,
Yeah, and probably faster too. Transmit ideas at the speed of thought.
well, I think
But then you've still
ultimately
got
this
Right.
this seems like it's ultimately an empirical question we don't have the tools to address. That
True.
like the answers to these things are not necessarily unknowable, but unknowable with the tools we have access to and that we could reasonably develop in the short term. So I
But on
don't
the
think
other-
it's a question that necessarily makes sense to discuss, even given that it's the answer depends on things we don't have.
Could we
True.
also, however, like see this as like a different kind of transhumanism, like going back to some of the things Hales talks about, sort of, where rather than it just being transhumanism by, like going to chop my arm off and, make put a new put a new better arm on, or rather than like implanting a brain implant in yourself. Could you imagine? We imagine a transhumanism which is basically about like learning a new language that say has a much higher information content, so you can sort of you can much more perfectly that more perfectly encodes our thought. Like if we're talking about language as a medium for encoding, then we're saying, well, current language is not that good at that kind of encoding. Can we then imagine a language that would be much better at it?
Hypothetically, but then we've got the process of creating that language, which needs to actually, we'd need to actually do that work. And I'm not sure that we'd know where to even start with that.
No,
Also-
that's a good point.
Also, like the evidence points more towards, if we're going to go with a kind of Sapir-Whorf idea, a much weaker sense of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. That I don't think necessarily that the evidence we have suggests that like creating a new language would radically change our thoughts or us. It might
No.
change how those thoughts are encoded in interesting ways. Definitely. But
Well, I
I'm not
think-
sure it gets at the essential thing.
So I think it's interesting in that, like, okay, let's look at the question of reflexivity or hyperstition, right? Before you learn about this, before you even heard the word, you might not have a concept for this sort of thing, but in the process of learning the word, you've got to form the concept. Or I remember what I was going to bring up earlier. I learned, I took a couple of classes on computer science because for a while I was trying to get a computer information systems minor. One of these classes was data structures. And early on, I did not get data structures. I actually had to take the class twice because I dropped it the first time and then retook it later. And at some point, it went from I can't think in these concepts suddenly the connections started forming, and I was able to sort of think in data structures. I haven't really practiced doing that for a while, but it was like a very sudden shift in a form of thinking. And so that's not even learning a new language. That's just learning a new set of tools for a specific task. Yet it was able to change some of how I conceptualize things in general. Right? So I'm not sure we can say for sure that creating a new perfect language would even be possible. But if it is possible, then the process of creating that language would it potentially inherently change some of how we think about thinking. Yeah.
So actually, on the topic of like programming languages, it is one of the interesting things. Is like, in a way, it is learning a new language because you are essentially just giving a computer instructions. But this is the thing that if learning to program changes the way you think, it's not because you're learning a new language. It's because fundamentally the way a programming language works is not the way a human language works. Because a programming language is essentially almost entirely instructions, but human language is mostly not instructions.
I think there's some interesting stuff in like philosophical logic, where the so-called dark prince of deviant logic.
Well, on the topic of programming languages, essentially the presupposition of a lot of the transhumanist concepts is that we are able to find the programming language of the brain.
Okay, so quick thing. Data structures is not a programming language per se. It is a way to consider structures of data and a way to how do I put this? It is a question of how you form data objects. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, it's
how the
data structures
data objects relate to each other.
Language. So
yeah, it's a relation of data and conceptualizing how these bits of information interrelate, right? So when you consider programming structures in terms of like creating a linked list, it's you think about this as implementing a series of data objects that connect one to the other, and they potentially loop back and connect back, but they don't necessarily do that unless you actually set up this relation in the data, right? Or in the object. Maybe not explaining this very well. But it's not the language itself. The programming language is just a way of encoding these instructions. The data structure is a way of thinking about the instructions, I guess. Or sort of instruction set. Oh, I guess Shadell disconnected for a second.
Yeah. Peel says in chat, how you store data. Programming language contains commands to instantiate data structures.
I need to dip.
Additional.
Bye, y'all.
Okay, see you in a bit, AI.
do we want to, I feel like this meeting is sort of starting to get to a close. Do we want to actually decide what we want to do next week before we all, before everybody crashes out?
I think we might want to next week just do a couple of short stories, one or two. Yeah.
I was thinking, considering the back half discussion of this, maybe we could do Seth Dickinson's oh god, what's it called? You probably mostly read it. The Seth Dickinson's like naval cephalopod subcommittee story.
The one where he wires himself into an octopus's brain?
And the one with the squid, certainly. It's not really that transhuman, but it is sort of.
I think we had a couple of fiction works we were talking about reading or watching. Sunny's Edge, for example, came up as a thing to read and watch. Let me see if I can find the actual short story. Sunny's Edge is an episode of Love, Death, and Robots, which is just a collection of short stories, or of sci-fi shorts. And it's based on Peter F. Hamilton's short story of the same name. So if we can find the...
At some point, I think we're going to have to read Peter Watts, but I don't know which Peter Watts story to read. Because like you don't want to have to like pull all the way through Blindsight, for instance, and I'm not even sure if that's still online. I mean, I don't really like Peter Watts' Blindsight, but I feel like, like in the same way that you have to read Nick Land's, you kind of have to, like, at some point we're going to have to talk about Blindsight.
Probably, yeah.
I mean, we don't have to decide right now, but like, I guess, do we want to actually kind of decide a theme before everybody goes? And then we can kind of assemble some stuff.
Yeah, well, one thing I was thinking while reading the first chapter of Hales is, one thing that came up was that this notion of embodying the post-human in bringing the flesh, bringing the meat back into things, actually made me think of Early Land's werewolf philosophy thing, or I guess that's a Deleuzian werewolf philosophy thing, and the sort of framework in Spirit and Teeth, which made me sort of ask myself the question, okay, does this relate to the idea that inhumanism is a post-humanism and the idea of the werewolf as a post-human entity?
Do we want to read that one?
Well, I'm down for anything about delicious meat.
Yeah. So I was potentially thinking, so if we're thinking about, if we're looking at Sunny's Edge, that sort of relates back to the humanist ideas of post-humanism, a very meat-based organic thing. So we could look at we could look at reading that at I'm trying to find a PDF of A Second Chance at Eden, which is a story that has Sunny's Edge. It's a little bit frustrating to find. But we could potentially read one or two short articles on basically like more biological forms of transhuman thoughts. There was one that AI suggested we read last week that we ended up not reading. Sort of biopunk thing, I think it was called.
that'd be cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, we don't have to necessarily. It sounds like we've kind of got the idea now, so we don't have to necessarily sort it all out now. But okay.
Yeah. So perhaps biopunks subverting biopolitics. Just found it. Nick Land's Spirit and Teeth, which I've already transcribed for something else, so I can get a copy of that without needing to share the full Genomina if people want.
Cool.
And Sunny's Edge, and then possibly have like a watch group watch Love, Death, and Robots, or that episode of Love, Death, and the Robots. Yeah. This might be interesting. Or we might not do that. Who knows? Anyway. Do we have any like closing thoughts other than that?
I want to read the rest of Hayes sometime now. I found chapter 10, which I think it looks pretty interesting.
I'm probably going to come back to Hales later myself, because I do view it as being very much in a dialogue with Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, and sort of expanding on the ideas there and offering up sort of new paths to take the ideas down, even if I'm not sure I'll necessarily agree with them all.
Cool. Okay, well, I'm going to sign off now. I'll see you guys all next week.
All right.
See you next week.
Later.
Same Transhuman channel.
All right. See y'all next time.